students, welcome Hoshamdeep and Hosh Galdanis. Today we are going to discuss a topic from the history of English literature, and that is Victorian poetry and poets. I have divided this very part in two presentations, in two sessions. Today I am going to discuss part 1 with you. So let's start our discussion. In the whole scenario of Victorian poetry, we are going to discuss these things. First of all, the introduction of Victorian age and the poetry. And part A, means session 1, includes the discussion on Alfred Tennyson, Robert Browning, and Matthew Arnold. The rest of the discussion will be in part B, as it is seen on the screen. I mean, you can see this on the screen. Today I'm going to discuss part A with you. Victorian age is considered a very productive age in terms of the production of poetry, prose, and novel, particularly the prose and poetry. Novel is also here. Maybe it falls into the category of prose, but the most prominent literary genres of the time are poetry and prose. Poetry, as we have almost 6 to 7 poets over here to discuss. These are the major poets of Victorian era, and there are some prose writers as well. I'll have a separate discussion with you on Victorian prose. Let's start the discussion on Victorian poetry. The poetry written during the time of Queen Victoria is known as Victorian poetry, and the poetry of this very age follows many traits of romantic age. Not exactly the romantic age, but somehow the poets of this era, Victorian era, they seem inspired of the romantic age as well. Those many previous trends include religious skepticism and art for art's sake. So we can find two major extremes in Victorian poetry, two extremes of trends. One is the trend towards the religious skepticism, and the second one is the poets who are writing under art for art's sake. Well, the poets of the and the poetry of this age are famous for the verbal as well as thematic embellishment. There are two types of themes which are often found in the Victorian poetry, and these thematic traits include skepticism and absurdist notions, because it was the time period when there were the very age, Victorian age, is also known as the age of hypocrisy, because there were two types of trends colliding against each other. On one hand, there was the religious skepticism, and on the other hand, there was the emergence of science and technology, rather the establishment of the paradigms of technology. They are colliding against each other as the powerful forces. So the effect is evident in the literature of the Victorian era as well as in the poetry of the Victorian era. So we are focusing on the poetry. We can find two types of thematic divisions in Victorian poetry, and that are skepticism and absurdist notions, and religious and mystic interrogations. The radical social change of the times, these changes have made many poets to question the previous norms of romantic poetry. Means some of them were following the romantic poetry, but some of them have some sort of interrogation in their mind regarding the paradigm of romantic poetry. Science, technology, and religion were colliding against each other, as they were 2 to 3 powerful forces of the time of the Victorian era. Due to the reasons of multiple conflicts ongoing in the society, the Victorian poetry is divided as the High Victorian poetry and the Pre-Raphaelite poetry. Victorian poets use excessive sensory imagery in their poetry. Not all of them, but a few of them. They are famous for their use of sensory imagery in their poetry, particularly Alfred Tennyson, as well as another one is there. Hopkins is also there, and somehow Rossetti is also there. Let's discuss Alfred Tennyson first. Alfred Tennyson is one of the representative poets of the Victorian era. His poems are marked with a dynamic range of topics. He has written on many topics. We can find the variations, the varieties of topics in Alfred Tennyson's poetry. And secondly, another important thing that is needed to be highlighted regarding Alfred Tennyson and his poetry is that we can find somehow the elements, the mythic elements in Alfred Tennyson's poetry as well. His inspiration from the classical Greek myth can also be found in his poetry. He has written on a lot of themes, including romance, nature, and politics. He has also tried to criticize the religious and political institutions by considering them a focal reason of the collapse of the whole social system. According to him, these institutions of religion and politics, they are actually they're causing the collapse of the social system of England on that time. His famous poetry carry a huge bulk of imagery, as I have already told you that he uses vivid imagery in his poetry and sensory imagery in his poetry as well. High use of sensory descriptions. Sometimes even the descriptions of women are also there in his poetry, the sensory descriptions. And his famous poem is Charge of the Light Brigade, and this is a political poem. I mean, this is a politically charged poem. The notions behind the writing of this poem were political. The next poet of, rather the representative poet of Victorian era is Robert Browning. And his creative life is marked by many obscurities, many ups and downs. And he's famous for writing dramatic monologues. Yes, this is the speciality of Robert Browning, that he is famous for writing a new, rather, we can say the type of visual poetry, and that is kind of poetry is known as dramatic monologue. He wrote the poems that are known as dramatic monologues. He has also contributed in writing children's literature. So he is one of those literary figures of the time who was concentrating on the needs of children's literature. So he also worked a lot in terms of creating children's literature. His contribution of monologues has made a great impact on the other poets of the time. Means his very experimentation with the form of poetry and introducing a new form, the dramatic monologue, this had made a great impact on the poets of that time, and they some of them tried to follow the footprints of Robert Browning by writing dramatic monologues. There are many works of Browning which are famous, but his dramatic monologue, My Last Touches, and dramatic lyrics are his milestones. Means these are the celebrated works of Robert Browning. Some of his works for children, like The Pied Piper, are greatly innovative in their nature. This type of character in children's literature, I mean, the children's poetry and fiction was first time introduced by Robert Browning. The next poet we are going to discuss today, the representative poet of the very era, Victorian era, is Matthew Arnold. Before discussing Matthew Arnold as a poet, I want to discuss few ground realities about Matthew Arnold, because Matthew Arnold was not only a poet, he was also a prose writer, and secondly, he was also an educationalist. So, his contributions as an educationalist, and secondly, his contribution as a prose writer, they are we can better to say they are more celebratable as compared to his poetry. They are excellent examples of the representation of the Victorian society and the challenges of the people of the time, particularly his essay, Culture and Anarchy, represents a vivid picture of the confused Victorian society of the time, and it addresses the cultural issues of the people of that time. But we will have a separate discussion on Matthew Arnold as a prose writer and as a critic. Well, let's discuss Matthew Arnold as a poet. Matthew Arnold is not only famous for his poetry but also for his criticism. As I have already told you, that he is not only a poet but also a prose writer, a critic, and his critical works are more inspirational as compared to his poetry. And Arnold, in his poetic nature, he seems inspired of the classicists because he has some seriousness and didacticism. These elements are prominent, are the prominent features of Arnoldian poetry. Arnold's poetry, like prose, is serious and didactic. His poetry advocates the values, feelings, and attitudes at the same time. So these things can be compared with the features of the classicist notions of poetry. His poetry often sounds satirically witty. So this is a very distinguished feature from the rest of the poets we have been discussed up till now, that his poetry often sounds satirically witty. So satire is also there, and wittiness is another feature of his poetry. Just like his prose, Arnold has tried his best to enlighten the minds of Victorian English society with his poetry. Yes, his prose is so enlightening, and it it does not only represent the problems of the society, rather it also provides the solution. So same is the case is with his poetry. In his poetry, he also tries to resolve, not only to reflect the minds of the society, but also to resolve the issues of the society. He also provides the solutions in his prose as well as in his poetry. Self-conscious and self-imposed nature of his poetry makes him a unique literary figure of his time. And this is another feature that is very much similar to the classicists. So, Matthew Arnold was a bit different than the other poets because he has some sort of didacticism in his poetry. He has tried to enlighten the minds of Victorian society with the help of his poetry as well as with the help of his prose. And secondly, his poetry's nature is self-conscious and self-imposed. So these are the prominent features of Matthew Arnold's poetry. We have been discussed three major poets in part one, means in this discussion, and the rest of the poets we will discuss in our session 2 in the next part of the session. Thank you so much for today. Allah Hafiz.